Well, it cost a great fortune to win a national election. Many candidates and parties resort to donations from outside the fund to really fund their campaigns. Parties also get funded by individuals who are most times not revealed, and this causes great debates around the nature of these donations and where they come from. In South Africa, a ConCourt ruling has opened up discussions about donor funding in the country's politics, the past 5 years of Cyril Ramaphosa's government and how he got to fund his election. Today on The Square, our focus is on donor funding in South African politics and what the rest of Africa should take from it. Welcome to VSA. I'm Sulaiman. The Constitutional Court last week ruled that the Executive Ethics Code is unconstitutional and invalid, as it does not compel members of the executive in South Africa to disclose donations made to campaigns within parties. The ConCourt, in the decision, upheld a ruling by the Pretoria High Court. It gave the Parliament 12 months to amend the code. The ruling is coming after Mabugani's Center for Investigative Journalism challenged the Executive Ethics Code. It argued that politicians could take advantage of gaps within the code to evade scrutiny. The Concourse ruling has been dubbed a victory for the desire for transparency and access to information. While the gains are enormous, the process of amendment may test the patience of South Africans, as it is expected to be long and tedious. The execution of the court laws also leaves some issues to be sorted, as there have been politicians and parties in the country who defy court orders. The Executive Members' Ethics Act is in place to ensure there are no unjustifiable influences of government's decisions. South Africa for many years has suffered from state capture, with citizens claiming that the country is partly ruled by certain powerful families who have sponsored the emergence of individuals. While there will be no retrospective declarations according to the ConCourt ruling, the new law will require all executive members, including the president, deputy president, members, and deputy ministers, to disclose their funding. This is a decision ruled by the critics of President Ramaphosa, who want him to declare the sources of his 2017 funding. Now, Tessa Dooms, political analyst, and Robyn, Pasensie, researcher, our party funding, both join me now. Ladies, good to see you both, and thanks for your time. Now, let's start with you, Tessa. Let's start by looking at the ConCourt's ruling on donor funding, what this means to South Africans.
What this really means in practice is that the party system, which has really dominated our electoral politics nationally, has now got a higher level of accountability within it. So the way in which our elections run is that we don't get to vote for individuals, we don't get to vote for the president, we only get to vote for the parties. And the parties then deploy MPs on our behalf and vote for a president on our behalf. And so when the internal party politics are happening and parties are busy electing their internal representatives, they, in many cases, especially with the ANC, as the only party that has had a governing majority in the country, when they have their internal politics, often they are electing people who will lead the country. But the financing of that has never been something that has been put under scrutiny within those parties or for the country. And I think it's really, really important that we are able to hold parties and party bosses to a higher account for the ways in which their politics run, who influences the politics, the interests that are behind those parties, because effectively they get to choose the leaders that we then have to live with for 5 years.
And Robyn, you know, this is something novel because it looks like as if South Africa is setting a precedent for other African countries to tour. Now, how does it ensure accountability going forward from here?
Well, good evening and thank you for having me on the show. I think Tess has already answered part of that question. Here in South Africa, what we vote for is actually a political party. And by doing that, we are implicitly putting our trust in the hands of that political party in order to pick those people that they think are not only up to doing the job, but they will actually represent our interests in parliament and going forward. In South Africa, as Tessa has already said, since 1994, the ANC has had the governing majority. And you mentioned in your introduction about President Cyril Ramaphosa's campaign in 2017 to be elected as president of the ANC. It has just been the way our politics has unfolded since 1994 that if you are going to give money to any person, incumbent or opposition, for president of the ANC, what you are actually doing is you are giving money to the campaign of the person who will likely end up becoming president of the country. So what this judgment from Amabungani's court case has given us is that it has reaffirmed really our commitment, at least from our ConCourt, our commitment to transparency and accountability in who funds our politics. I think South Africans are well beyond fed up with corrupt activities from our politicians and really not knowing what it is that they are doing for us once we put our X in that ballot box. So I think what's important about this ConCourt judgment is that it very explicitly exemplifies the point that we really do need to place emphasis on shining a light on secrecy in party funding and uprooting that.
And Tessa, this is all about the fight against corruption, isn't it?
We all know that politics often has a big financial interest that can be used for people's power to be bought. And I think in South Africa, we've suffered not only from corruption in terms of state bureaucracy and money from the state being just used or misused or mismanaged. We've suffered from having really a lot of big, powerful players in our society. We are the most unequal country in the world. And so the concentration of wealth is in the hands of a very few people, which means that they have the kind of resources that if they wanted to use it to buy politicians and fund politicians for their own business interests or for their own selfish interests, they're able to do that. And we've seen it in politics around the world. We see a system like the US, where there's an open lobbying system where people who have particular kinds of interests can financially back. The difference here is that in the US, they're saying, tell us who your backers are. So yes, we can't stop people from backing particular politicians. We can't stop the NRA, the National Rifle Association in the US, from funding a Republican candidate who's willing to suppress protecting people from gun violence. But here in South Africa, we don't know who the funders are in the main. My Vote Counts organization that has worked really hard on this has gotten us the first step a few years ago when we got a political party funding act that said that parties, once they are in power, have to tell us who is funding them on an ongoing basis so that we can see the interest behind it. But what this bill really does is it says to us that we can see who the people are who are backing you. And so if you start giving them special favors, if you start giving them deals, if you start creating policies that are in their interest rather than the interest of the majority, we then know where the source of corruption is.
And you know, Robyn, following the money, taking off the veil so that people understand and know who exactly these sponsors or supporters are, is very key here now. Help us make sense of, you know, how this can be so established in South Africa and perhaps in other African countries and even Nigeria.
Well, I think the issue of financing in politics, and Tessa touched on this, is it's everywhere. We can't really stop somebody or an organization or entity if they are interested in giving of their own private money to a political party, then they should be able to. What we're really wanting to see here, not just in South Africa, but in Nigeria, across the continent, and indeed across the world, is that we have a set of accountability measures. So what is specific about the Amabungani ConCourt judgment is that this talks specifically to if you are running for a position in your own political party and you are receiving money to that campaign, Now this judgment is saying you should be compelled to make that known. You mentioned this already. We are going to be seeing a very long process to actually have the executive ethics code amended. And I think we as South Africans are all on 10 hooks that this actually take place before the 2024 elections. Parliament is actually, the president has been given 12 months to do that amendment. But while we wait for that, we also have the Political Party Funding Act that Tessa has mentioned. And here we at MyVote Counts really push on the importance of that because it does the exact same thing as we want to see with the Executive Ethics Code, which is that political parties should be compelled to say who their donors are. So I think for us, particularly as civil society who are pushing on this point, really what this means is consistent advocacy and agitation in our political system and with our politicians, our lawmakers specifically, because even with the Political Party Funding Act that we currently have in place, only a year old, the declarations that we've seen from that, from the donations that parties receive, has actually confirmed our suspicions in that only a small group of people seem to be financing our politics, and that is an issue.
And Tessa, no one would want to, hide under a cloud or under a veil if it's okay. Everyone would want to be out. It's akin to someone trying to work on a local project. You come out in the open and you say, these are the sponsors. Now, is there any kind of pushback against this ruling in South Africa at the moment, and from what quarter?
In general in the country, but particularly the ANC, because they've got such a huge stake in this, at accepting the court's ruling at face value. But we've seen it time and time again. The Political Funding Act and the changes to that law was one of those opportunities. We're seeing it currently. We have an electoral reform bill that's before Parliament, where they would accept in principle the judgment and not push back on that, but then drag their feet until it becomes absolutely, non-negotiable that they can't do it, because it's not expedient for them to do it. So it's not in their own interest that as parties to hold themselves to account, and so they drag their feet, and we see that time and time again. But why it's really important, regardless of Parliament's, sluggishness with this, or they're dragging their feet, or trying to create bills that are not useful, is we must push for these, because we have seen that once the bill is passed, once we have this kind of legislation, it actually does mean that the parties have to work harder for their votes. Currently, we've seen with the big parties, the ANC, the DA, because there's a threshold now to how much parties can receive that before they have to declare. You're seeing that parties have less funders who are willing. And you have to ask the question, as you rightfully said, if your bona fides are in place, if your funding is above board, if you're not expecting kickbacks, if you're not expecting favors, then you should be openly willing to give whatever amount to the party of your choice if it's support in good faith. But we're now realizing, and I'm seeing that the big parties are suffering under this, where they're now not able to run big campaigns, they're not able to pay their staff because their funders are not willing to be transparent. And we must create a political culture that says politics is about more than just casting our vote. Politics is happening on a day-to-day basis. It's about who has power and who doesn't have power. And people who are financing have power, and that power must be held to account. So this is not only about holding the politicians accountable, it's also about holding the financiers accountable. And I think we are much closer to that now because of this ruling than we've ever been before.
And Robyn, what does this, mean, or what does the South African people make of the court's decision, especially on retrospective declaration of funding? Because some are already speaking out on this.
I think because a lot of people have followed this quite closely, because the impetus for this action really has its roots in the conversations and our public protector's report around the CR17 campaign, as it's colloquially known here, Cyril Ramaphosa's election campaign in 2017, and the allegations that there was impropriety around that. So I think while we are celebrating, we at MVC, at Amabongani, are very happy with this court judgment. And Tessa has explained exactly why that is the case. But I think there is, at least from our side, a feeling of, well, in part a little bit too late. That, as you said, this ruling does not apply retrospectively. So we may never know, using this particular ruling and the amendment to the Executive Ethics Code that will follow, we will not be able to, under that, try and seek recourse for the information that we may want to see under CR17. So I think that is definitely a loss, but I don't think that that should put a stop to our action. Going forward, we are still going to be seeing the ANC in positions of power. We are still going to be seeing other large parties, even the smaller ones, also fighting for positions of power. And this is an exceptionally important judgment. So yes, not the best when we look at, do we want to actually know what happened in CR17? Now we will not know that. But it is precisely because of that and the allegations of corruption that now we actually see something fruitful come out of that particular experience.
And Tessa, state capture has been a regular theme in your country. And looking at recent happenings, how does it help, to protect against such occurrences?
Yeah, I think the term state capture has made it a very narrow focus on the Jacob Zuma administration and presidency, because that's the term that we used to describe what was happening there with the Gupta family in particular. But all of this that we're talking about is about state capture. It's about the repurposing of the state to serve interests of individuals or people who are outside of government, and using the state for that. And so all of this is actually part of the state capture narrative. And that state capture narrative does not start when Jacob Zuma comes into power. It starts right at the beginning of our democracy, where we really just have not had a good sense about how money is influencing politics and whose interests the politicians actually serve. And particularly in a system like ours, where we don't vote directly for a president, we don't vote directly for a member of parliament, we have no ability to hold them to true account. We have no ability to recall them, and they don't feel like they're answerable to us. And so we must ask the question, who are they answerable to? Because those people have captured the state rather than the people capturing the state. And so again, these kinds of rulings and these kinds of judgments are really about saying that democracy needs to be real. If we are going to say that the democracy means that the people shall govern, all of the people must be stakeholders in that governance, rather than the wealthy only having access to politicians who act on their behest. If we do not change these kinds of patterns across the continent, if we don't make it so that people who have wealth can then continue to use the state and the state's resources through politicians for their own ends, then we will never ever have a democracy that is real and that will manifest true results for people everywhere.
And Tessa, let me stay with you for a bit before I come back to Robyn. This is about democracy, and it is one aspect of democracy that Africans even, have ignored for too long. Now, this is not a South African problem, listening to you. What can the rest of the continent learn from this?
I think there are many lessons to be learned here. One of them is that simply running elections is not enough. That I know that across the continent, there's still a big cry out from people saying we don't even have credible elections yet. We're not even sure that we can trust the bona fides of our election. I think what our case study in South Africa shows, that simply having elections is not enough, and that we cannot reduce as a continent our entire understanding of living in a democracy to the ability to vote once every 4 or 5 years. We all need to think about, on a day-to-day basis, how do we self-govern? And we've taken and we've borrowed a lot of our models from other places. We've borrowed a lot of our models from Western countries and from Eastern countries, and we've borrowed this. But we need to also rethink democracy for ourselves. Democracy isn't prescriptive. Democracy is about people's governance. And we need to say, how do we in the continent want to make sure that people in every city and in every village are able to participate in self-governance? And it's not that far off, because we know in African societies, there's a lot of self-governance that happens. People are continually finding ways to make their lives work, whether the state works or not. And we need to convert that power to govern ourselves, to govern our families, to govern our cultures, to govern our traditions. And we need to start saying we need to use this to govern our societies at a political level. We cannot just continue to do things that are not working for us. We must find ways to ensure that people's power goes beyond the vote, because then our democracy will become real.
And Robyn, speed is of essence here. How quickly do we expect the Parliament to amend this act?
Well, according to the ConCourt judgment, they've been given 12 months. So we assume by the end of September 2023. But Tessa mentioned this earlier. Sometimes the wheels of bureaucracy don't turn as quickly as we would like it to. We do have an electoral reform bill that is currently making its way through Parliament, and the process has been critiqued throughout because there has just been some procedural flaws. The Political Party Funding Act, from the time that the bill was actually agreed to in Parliament until the time that the president signed it, was over a year, and then another year from that point until he actually gave a date of commencement, which was the 1st of April last year. So if we were just going on precedent, the 12 months may not be long enough, but as it stands, the ConCourt ruling very clearly states that they have 12 months in order to amend this. This does mean, of course, that we are going to miss vital information for the ANC's upcoming elective conference in December. As you mentioned already, this judgment does not apply retrospectively, so we will not be able to use this hopefully amended law in a year's time to access information about that and the campaign money spent there. But looking forward, obviously, we should be able to hopefully post-September next year.
And Robyn, still with you, Robyn, corruption, every time people speak of corruption, they look at the big politician and they forget the small man in that municipality. Now, corruption, no doubt, like in Nigeria and so many other African countries and some parts of the world, has been one of those problems mentioned, especially in politics. Now we're talking about South African politics. How does this court ruling help to limit it?
Well, in a direct way, if we're talking about at the local level, the representative, your ward councillor, going further up to your mayor or your premier, anything below national level, it doesn't necessarily mean that this judgment is going to affect that running specifically. So remember, this ConCourt judgment is talking about if you, as a member of any political party, if you want to run for a position, an executive position in your party, let's say president of your party, deputy president, and you were sourcing money to run that campaign, so in other words, campaign funding for that, then you would need to declare that. And as Tessa put so eloquently earlier, this is important for if you are going to be voted into power, and then now you are going to be seated at various levels of government, from national all the way down to the local level. If you, as the president or the other executive member, you've accepted money from a particular interest group or a lobby group or a private business individual, it is likely that you are not going to undertake to make decisions that are going to go against where your money is coming from. You are going to want to protect that cachet of money. And so that decision-making process will filter down from the top to the bottom. But if we were looking at the actions of individuals within a party, individuals within that system of governance from national down to local, you can also expect to see sort of individual or small scale corruption or corrupt activities. And while corruption was not birthed in the Zuma years alone, they do provide a good place to look into how corruption and sort of patronage did take hold in South African politics. And when you look at our commission of inquiry into state capture under the Zuma years, you'll see that for even small amounts of money, local officials, government, civil servant people, all the way down in sort of your ordinary face-to-face local level, were also committing corrupt activities. So while this judgment is important, it does speak to us, it has a specific role, and that we need to be very clear about. But it does provide the next step, I think, in a broader framework of trying to shift a political culture that is one of self-enrichment. We want to move away from that and move towards broad-based citizen support and representation, if this is to be the kind of model of democracy that we want.
And Tessa, I see you nodding your head then. Shifting away from that culture, it means victory for journalism, especially investigative journalism, and even civil society organizations in South Africa, isn't it?
And if there's anything that South Africa needs, and I think many countries at this point in history need, is a shift in political culture. I think we've all grown very weary of the kind of politics we've seen in the last 2 or 3 decades, a politics that has centralized elites in our society, a politics that has been about big men and big women stamping their authority, not being willing to not even share power, not being willing to leave power. And we have to shake that up. And we're not going to shake that up by leaving it up to existing politicians. We all need to understand that politics is about the power to act. It's about the power of every one of us in our societies to take action. And so whether these have come now through court victories, as we've seen now with these court cases, or whether it comes through citizen engagement and civic education, we must start putting as much pressure on the system to say that there are certain parts of our system that absolutely have to change. We're not going to wait for the politicians because they got there through these systems. And so we have to change politics from the outside in. From outside of the political establishment, we're all going to have to do more than just shouting out and making our voices known. We're going to have to start doing very tactical things to change the system and ensure it moves in the direction we need it to.
We'll take a moment. When we come back, we'll be looking more at what this may mean for South Africa and other parts of the continent, specifically even for Nigerians as they go into the big election. As many have said, African politicians actually dip their hands in the cookie jar to sponsor elections. That's when we return. Well, if you just joined us, you're welcome. You're watching Villa Square Africa, broadcasting live to 54 African countries and beyond. And we're looking at the issues around donor funding in South Africa, which again, clearly resonates among other African countries, specifically its politics. South Africans may have their celebration limited over the ruling, as it's not expected to be effected before the 2024 election. But consultations are expected to be conducted before the South African president will sign the amendment into law. What's dubbed a victory for voters may not be a victory for the South African political parties, as many never declared the source of their funding, Nigeria inclusive. The Democratic Alliance, that's the DA, the country's main opposition, has welcomed the decision of the court and said it is compiling a private member's bill just to amend the act. Now, the Public Protector's Office also has welcomed the decision. Public Protector Bosiwe Nkwabani Nkwambane in 2020 found that Ramaphosa had breached the code by not disclosing donations he received for his CR17 campaign. Still with me here, pushing it to an anchor point, is Tessa Dooms and Robyn Pasensie. But quickly here, okay, Robyn, I see you're still very much there. Thanks for your time. Now, let's speak more about this ruling. We spoke about the municipalities, the local politician, and how this can also trickle down. But have you been able to have any kind of conversation with some of these local politicians? Do they truly understand the import of this, push?
Well, in all honesty, we haven't yet had an opportunity to chat to our politicians, particularly those who work at the local level, as to what their actual reactions are to this. But I think what could be quite telling about this is that this is an executive ethics code. So in other words, this only applies to executive members. It's not something that is widely applicable to every member of parliament, because not every member of parliament is an executive member. So that could be one of the reasons why we don't hear a particular public outcry or anything like that from all of our politicians. I think also just going off of the reactions that we've had to the Political Party Funding Act, that took a very, very long time to actually get into Parliament in the first place. It's a process that took almost 20 years in the making. And along the way, our political parties and our politicians were not wholly in favor of this particular move. And some of our political parties, the Democratic Alliance included here, have made comments in public since the PPFA has been in effect along the lines of, because it is a law, we will obviously follow it. But they're not particularly happy around the imposition that this puts on them and their ability to raise funds. So one can perhaps assume that going forward, that the kind of imposition that the amendment to the Executive Ethics Code puts on executive members to actually make known where their private funding is coming from for the campaigns, we may see a similar outcry sometime in the future.
And does this code serve to protect the individuals who fund these parties? Because it seems as if that's the worry of some of these sponsors.
I'm so sorry, Sulaiman. I think the sound cut out there for a moment. Would you mind repeating the question?
No, I'm asking if this code actually, okay, I see, Tessa, good to see you back. Thank you very, very much. We're trying to look at if this actually also protects the donor who ordinarily should get some form of protection from going public, knowing that he or she may want to be anonymous.
Well, I mean, in terms of anonymity, this is an issue that's come up before with regards to political party funding under the PPFA. And some of the claims around the inability to raise more funding has come from some parties like the ANC saying that, well, now our donors are actually shying away because they're afraid that their names may be known in public. And while I suppose we should strive to protect, obviously, everybody who makes a donation, given the state of our politics at the moment, given the state of secrecy and corruption that we have that exists, making your name known when you have a donation should be a minor price to pay, no pun intended for that. And the same here for the Executive Ethics Code. The people of South Africa deserve the right to know who is actually funding our political parties and who specifically, in the case of the Executive Ethics Code, who is providing those funds to those people within political parties to run for those executive positions. That's really important. And if you cannot pass muster on that, then we should reserve the right to follow recourse to do that.
And Tessa, will this ruling reveal more details about corruption in the country's politics?
Yeah, I think what this ruling does is it actually does help us to think about corruption as a continuum rather than corruption as something that only politicians do. And so to the point that Robyn was making, For me, the idea that a funder doesn't want to be known, to be associated with a political party or to be funding a political party raises questions about their ethics and their motivations. And we have to then be able to say, how do we hold them accountable? Because corruption is a continuum. There isn't just the corrupted person. There's also the corruptee, the person who's in relationship. I remember in the early 2000s when we had Jacob Zuma, then the deputy president of the country, and a businessman called Shabir Sheikh, where the NPA, the National Prosecuting Authority, decided that they were going to charge and take to court Shabir Sheikh, who they eventually found guilty of corruption, but then didn't follow up on Jacob Zuma because he was going to become president, the corruptee, the one who was corrupted. And this is now the opposite, where we are saying we actually want to know in these relationships who is benefiting from these relationships in both directions so we can have accountability in both directions. When private citizens, when private individuals, when private companies decide that they're going to put their money towards public office and public service, they are opening themselves up to scrutiny, and we should be able to scrutinize them and hold them accountable in the same ways we do the public offices themselves.
And Tessa, what has to be done to fast-track the amendment? Because looking at 2024 in 2022, that's pretty longer time.
Yeah, I think this is going to have very little bearing on 2024 itself, especially in light of the bigger organizations, the bigger parties, who will likely have their political contests in the next 12 months or so. And it's only really in 12 months' time that we even begin to see this law coming into effect. Parliament has 12 months, then it still would need to go to the president to sign and take effect. So I don't think this is going to have much of an effect on 2024 itself. And so again, because it's not retrospective, we won't get to see much. But it is important for us as the citizens, as civil society, as people who care about our political landscape, to put the requisite amount of pressure to fast track it anyway, to make sure it gets done as soon as possible. But also we've learned with the electoral reform process to pay careful attention to the details they put into the bill. The politics of it is about trying to create loopholes and trying to create ways around it. So we must be hyper vigilant to say, get it done as soon as possible, because that's what the law says. You have 12 months, and politicians and parliamentarians should do their job, and we should create public pressure for them to do that job. But more importantly, we must look at the details of the kind of legislation they come up with to make sure that it's not vague, that it's rational, that it passes constitutional muster, but that it does the thing that the judgment asks of it to do, which is make sure that we have a higher level of accountability from the people we elect into office.
And of course, Robyn, will this also help, see new entrants in politics? Because at the moment in Africa, South Africa inclusive, it looks as if you must have a deep pocket before you can get into politics.
Well, yeah, I mean, in South Africa, currently with the IEC, our electoral body, we have over 500 registered political parties. So I think South Africans take very seriously the ability to be able to contest an election. But of course, the ability to enter into a political party, to register with the IEC, doesn't automatically mean that you are actually going to end up being voted into parliament. And as Tessa mentioned earlier, the kind of system that we have is that we don't actually vote directly for an individual. At present, all we can vote for is a political party, and you need to win a certain amount of seats. You need to win a certain amount of votes, and that will equate to one seat in parliament. So you actually need quite a hefty amount of votes if you were actually going to get into parliament in the first place. So it can be quite a long road to get there. So I think, generally speaking, I don't think that this particular judgment is going to have any direct bearing on smaller parties being able to be more competitive in the electoral space. Where they may see slightly more improvement is perhaps under the Political Party Funding Act, which does make allowances for smaller parties to receive a slightly greater slice of the pie in terms of public funding once they do become elected into national or provincial legislature. So I think there's still a long ways to go in order to push funding to our smaller political parties. And perhaps once this electoral reform process has concluded, that may actually include independent candidates in the future.
And Robyn, staying with you still, talking about small political parties and big political parties, isn't it amazing that sometimes you get to see a member of a small political party going around seeking funding, but you never see a politician from any of the big parties, even in Nigeria, asking for funding? What does this tell you?
Well, I mean, it's quite interesting. I think we should not assume that just because it is not out in the public domain, that a big splash is being made about it, that our larger political parties and our sort more well-known politicians aren't going out there and seeking funds and courting donors. I think we should very much assume that that is the case. Political parties, whether we like it or not, do need money. They do need money in order to function, particularly when it comes to paying their overhead costs, like paying staff salaries. So that needs to be done. I think our image of smaller parties is perhaps that they are scrounging around for money because they are small, because they are perhaps lesser known. And so now they really have to go out there and be more aggressive in their strategy to get funding. Just because they are small, and that's what they are doing, that does not mean that once you're bigger, that stops. In fact, the ANC in the last 18 months has actually come out very clearly and said that they are having trouble with getting funds. And they have come out swinging and asking, we actually do in fact need money. In fact, they have come out and made threats about amending the Political Party Funding Act to increase the threshold amounts that allow for disclosure so that they can ramp up more funding from bigger donors. So yes, I do think that even if we are not necessarily reporting on it or seeing it in the media, our bigger political parties are in fact still courting donors. And I would say it's safe to assume they are courting those big donors quite hard.
And Tessa, apart from dues and levies from members within such political parties, are there other ways known to non-party members how these political parties actually get funding before now?
Well, that's an interesting one because in our system, really traditionally, from the point of democracy at least, party dues and memberships were meant to be the mainstay of parties, and particularly for parties at the scale of our big three parties that are looking at the hundreds of thousands or millions of members. The ability to get party dues should be the ways in which you bedrock yourself, because there's a benefit to that. It gives you a greater incentive to, number one, recruit members and have an offering that a member is willing to be engaged in, but also to decentralize power. One of the things we're really thinking about in our civil society context is the question about how do we devolve power away from the central party headquarters so that where political activities are happening, people are actually able to fund those political parties at local levels. There's no reason why somebody who's paying party dues only needs to pay those party dues for the big bosses of the party to then centrally make decisions. There should be models that say, at a local level, crowdfund, raise funds within your organization, within your community, within your locality for the kind of political work you do at a local level. It doesn't make sense to pay my dues and then it goes to the party level. And then when we need to be doing party activities or we need to be doing political work, I now have to go and then request that money back. There have to be other more creative ways of doing these things. And I think we don't think enough about the fact that if somebody is willing to part with their money to support a political cause, then parting with their vote becomes so much easier. But now the model has become, let's get one or two big donors to give us $1 million, as opposed to getting 1 million people to give us $1. And I think we must start to think that it's more important to get many people's buy-in, literal buy-in, and many people who are willing to support, and many people who see value in your party work, who see value in the governance that you show, that they are willing to part with even the little that they have in order to support that, because it's supporting the country that they're in, the society they're in, and their own lives. Until political parties see value in that, and they're willing to provide value to even the poorest of the poor, the person in the most marginal communities, we will perpetually see them looking for the big donors, very politically lazy, who will give them millions, but they will always be beholden to those one or two people rather than to the masses of people.
And Tessa, don't you see a challenge in getting the numbers, especially from the populace, to have a buy-in, especially going forward in embracing a new type of culture of funding for politics?
I really don't. I really think people are done with elite compacts between political elites and economic elites. I think that the economics of it, the political economics, as it were, of it, would be a real motivator for people. There are lobby groups in South Africa, some of them more on the right of the spectrum, so their intentions are not always something that I personally would agree with, but who are a small population, a minority population. But every month, people in those communities give towards lobby groups that lobby for their interests. And the reason why they're willing to do that is they see some sort of value from it. They see those people championing the causes and winning the debates and having the kinds of conversations that they feel forward their own interests. And we see it in other parts of our society in Africa. I mean, if you look at East Africa has a huge culture of small money in terms of investment circles, saving circles, different kinds of groups where people are willing to, in a collective sense, support each other and support efforts because they can see the value. Our political parties have become lazy about delivering value to masses of people, and therefore they can't get people to part with $1 or $2 in the same ways that in society we are willing to trust each other with $1 or $2. It's really poor politics, and I think it is politics that can change because people will pay for, contribute to, show up for political value, especially in governance.
And Robyn, the people are expecting what you call a political culture change. So what changes do we expect in South African politics from here?
Well, I think, first of all, what we want to see stemming from this is that the amendment process will, in fact, run smoothly, procedure it will be done accurately, and then hopefully after that, once we see this amendment, that we will now be able to, under this executive ethics code, be able to see the transparency that we've been talking about. Concomitant with that, we should also be looking at as a people about agitating with our politicians precisely on this point that Tessa has brought up, is that we don't want to see our political parties, our politicians courting big money. There is this kind of political dissonance with our representatives where they depend on us for their vote to actually be in a position of political power. But once they have that, then they don't need us anymore. And instead of continually trying to court us, win us over, prove to us, not just in the run-up to a national election that they are there for us, but that they are actually there for us all of the time, not some of the time. And I think that is really where our work is at presently. It's to be aware and to agitate and push on that point for that shift in political culture that we are looking for. I mean, Tessa said it really well here. You should not be looking at ordinary citizens to necessarily shell out hundreds of thousands or millions of rands. Instead, you should be looking at your voter base, at your citizenry, as a space in which you can actually show that this is what we are doing for you. And then they will reciprocate that with, even if it's small tokens that say, yes, this is actually what I want you to do, and I give this to you to act on my behalf. So I think that is the space that we currently find ourselves in, and that is going to take some time to put in place.
And Tessa, do you think we should start redefining politics, for the people to mean service, an actual service? Perhaps that will make them have a better understanding of contributing to the drive of their own political leaning.
I think that that's another very, lengthy political culture conversation that as a continent particularly we must have, is that we must start seeing people who take up political office in two ways. One, we must start seeing them as people who we are putting there in our stead to serve our interests, rather than calling them our leaders, because they are not leaders in some sort of monarchy sense where the queen, leads her society and she's above her society. No, they are people who are put there to represent us and to work on our behalf. They are workers. They are the number one workers of society. So the idea of a celebrity culture that we've formed around politicians needs to end. We must stop celebrating politicians as if they are these, above society types of figures. Even the terms that we're using, we talk about your excellency. The rest of the world doesn't necessarily use that language about calling your politicians excellency and having to use these terms of deference, because those people are supposed to be the number one workers of the country, not the number one beneficiaries or the number one celebrities of the country. That's a big cultural shift. But the second thing that we absolutely must do in our society to change these things is we must start saying that the work that politicians do is only one part of politics, that there are other ways in which, even if I'm not the representative of the society at the political level, that I can still be part of our politics. I can still be part of accountability. I can still be part of using my power to change my society in other ways. I can participate in governance even if I'm not the representative. So that politics isn't the domain of a few. And those people who do get elected must also learn to move on to other things. Go and serve your country for 5 years and literally serve. Have a mission, have a goal, have work you're going to do, serve, and then go and move on and serve the country in other places. Serve the country in business afterwards or in civil society afterwards. We mustn't see politics as this perpetual career or this thing that people are ordained into for life. We must see it as a place of service and a place where we can then move on and serve in other parts of society when we're done there.
And at this point, I'd like to say thank you, Tessa and Robyn, for your service. I hope to see you both again on the show. I'm Sulaiman. Thanks for watching.